here. Call the meeting to order. Read the roll, please.
Vice Mayor Schaefer,
Here.
Vice Chairman Jones,
Here.
Chairman DeGenova.
Here. We have a fairly simple agenda, but yet it's a compound, complex agenda. So we'll try to get through this. I've had a real long day, and some of the others have also. Item 2 is review of requests from OnlyFans and View condominiums pursuant to Section 92904 of the City Codified Ordinance. And I think everyone got a copy of it.
Yeah, the actual letter was in our previous packet, but it was essentially a request from OnlyFans and View condominiums for a waiver pursuant to the city's refuse collection ordinance. But I'm going to let Bill just provide a little bit of the background on it. This item could have gone to the Public Works Committee, Finance Committee. It's ultimately some policy questions that City Council will need to address.
This is a reference to that gentleman who was here.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. So what I put before you is the refuse collection ordinance, chapter 929 of the city's charter code of ordinances. Most of this was established back in the 80s, and it really outlines the city's policy with respect to refuse collection. And if you take a look at 929.01, the first page, if you look at E is in Edward, it says domestic premises, means all premises used for the purpose of human habitation, which would include apartments, single-family, multifamily, two-family dwelling units. And if then you turn to the third page and you go to 929.04, this is really what, and you go in this last paragraph, the last sentence there, it says, only in extreme unusual circumstances, the director may waive the requirement to subscribe to the service. So everybody subscribes to the service. And I'll let Bill kind of fill in some of the background in this. Bill?
Well, before Bill gets started, too, I just want to comment that this is not the first time this has come up since this ordinance has been.
Now, this comes up from time to time, and it's really, I think you need to start with the questions of why the city is in this business, or why we care to regulate the business, and I think that's really what we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about tonight is that. But I can have Bill, if you want to just.
Sure, I'll give just some real brief. I mean,
Synopsis of it.
we heard Mr. Price discuss and council make a request regarding us taking a look, at least considering him opting out of our service. He's not the first one to make that request from a multifamily standpoint. We've also had Hayes Colony apartment complex, as well as the Troy Farms apartments, Castro Communities, make similar requests over the past year and a half. As Tom mentioned, our policy right now doesn't allow us to just let somebody opt out of our policy under this section. They are considered residential, and we treat all residential, including the High Wesleyan's residential units, the same. Everyone participates in our policy fairly. No one gets to opt out. So at least initially, we're not inclined to say there's any provision in our code or something so different or special about these three particular locations that would say, well, yeah, this is somehow different than the next apartment, so you should opt out. So we're not inclined necessarily to consider that favorably that way. What we are more inclined to do and recommend, we've had some light discussion about this over this year, is to look maybe a little more comprehensively about, as Tom mentioned, about our policy in general. What is our mission statement for providing refuse service in the city of Delaware to our constituency? What are our level of service expectations, and how do we get to that point? Obviously, right now it's a combination of public service and private service. The private service is basically limited to commercial collection of the majority of businesses in town. A small percentage of businesses and most public agencies subscribe to the city service. And then all the multifamily, which is 83 or so locations, also subscribe to our service. And they pay a rate based on dumpster size, but they're considered part of our service because of the residential. Last time it was was before my time. I've been here 23 years, 22, 23 years. We've looked at rate analysis in that time frame, but we haven't gone comprehensively back, I don't believe, into our code and what makes up the section of our code that governs and regulates residential, or not residential, but all refuse collection. There's quite a few things that are different today than were back the last time this code may have been adjusted. And that's the fact that our landfills now have been closed for 25 years, maybe 30 years, since the mid 80s, I think, mid to late 80s. Also, EPA regulations are substantially different now. They require us, recycling programs require us to reduce waste through recycling programs. And our general makeup of the community is substantially different as well in terms of number of units we have, so we can collect more refuse more efficiently. We adopted the toter program back in the early 2000s, which has been successful as a means to control pricing. But all this together suggests that maybe we look a little more comprehensively at our mission statement for refuse collection and look at, are we on track with it still? Should we expand what we do? Should we just maintain what we do? Or should we not do certain parts of that, of the collection service? Maybe it's commercial. We don't want to pick up dumpsters anymore. Not saying that's the case, but we need to look at a little more comprehensively what are our goals with refuse. There's a lot of, our system works really well right now for what we do. And what we find out when there's a complaint or issue and we say, let's address it, let's address this one issue, we find out there's always a domino effect of why it is the way it is. And if we decide to change that, 10 other things may change for that. And it may impact staffing. It may impact how we collect somebody else's refuse. So it makes more sense to pull back and say, let's look at our policies and what are we trying to accomplish with our policies. And then move forward from there. And certainly one part of that, as the owner of Olentangy Apartments says, is the pricing point. I think there's an argument from his point that in a free market society, they should have the right or the ability to get the lowest and best price they possibly can. Well, that may or may not be true or may not match up with what our policy or our goals and objectives are for providing refuse service for the city. If in order to accomplish that goal, it means sacrificing some of the part of the refuse service. When I say sacrificing, I mean changing the service, whether it's private or public. Level of services are definitely tied to that question right there. So I think what we're probably talking about is coming back, identifying the appropriate committee, whether it's Finance Committee, Public Works Committee, as a starting point, and try to get some of our policy objectives, look at our current code, look at our current policy, and try to boil that down to the several nuggets of policy that are really important to the city in terms of refuse collection. Whether it's a clean downtown or every residence gets treated with special, that we go back, we do callbacks, we clean up messes. There's some policy issues here that really drive what's best for the city. And then from that, we can look at, well, is there pricing? Is there a way to change pricing or make adjustments that could impact the pricing, both for residential and for the commercial collection as well as multifamily? So that'd be our recommendation, is that it's probably appropriate. It's been close to a couple of decades to look at that and have an opportunity to re-identify what the mission statement and priorities are for this community through council, and begin to look at that, our policy and practices that way.
So we really, I'm going through here real quick on 929 refuse costs. There's really nothing that tells us about pricing in this.
But our pricing is included as part of the code, but it's not broken down specifically to answer Mr. Price's section.
And that was his concern, was
Yeah.
what we were charging.
We do have published pricing for our dumpster collection, and he is looking at independent rates and able to, like anything else you do, he can find it cheaper, like you can find a cheaper car or you can find a cheaper home.
And that's what we've always debated on in the
Yes.
past, was that anything can be cheaper.
Right.
We kind of stuck.
I mean, I could call us a single family home and say, I called Republic Waste and they can pick my waste up for $14 a month, and the city makes me pick it up for, you're charging me 19, and I don't think I should have to pay 19. And I mean, but it gets back to putting aside the pricing of why it's a public purpose, why it's a public service to begin with, and that's some of it.
Seems to me though that having individual houses opt out makes less sense than taking a look and say, in these multifamily units of a certain size, does it make sense to give them the opportunity to opt out? I mean, you wouldn't want to have, go down the street and have 3 different refuse companies coming into town to pick up refuse, but in the case of a large apartment complex, or whatever we determine is the right size, maybe they would have that ability. I mean, would that make sense to at least look at that?
And that's part of the framework for the way you look at this. It might
Right.
turn out, it might be that you go through the analysis, or you go through the kind of the test for why it's a public service, why do we provide it, or why do we
Right.
cause it to be provided? It
Right.
could be that the commercial multifamily may not meet all those tests.
Right.
And therefore, we say 33 years ago is when we established this. We had landfills, we had fewer apartment complexes. They probably had fewer options at the time. You didn't have BFY and waste management on the
Right.
other entities. So
Right.
The issue, and that's why we really need to focus on the public policy, the public service side of it, not what we charge or how we deliver that service. Quite frankly, there's a lot of city services that we have a monopoly over, and we can regulate that because the Ohio Revised Code allows us to. I just looked up here. It spills over a little bit to our secondary discussion about cemeteries. But ORC section 715.43 regarding refuse systems, any municipality or court may provide for the collection, disposal of sewage, garbage, blah, 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 and for the disposal thereof. In essence, it says you can regulate that and control that. We can have a closed system. And there are many cities that do. I was looking at some different cities like Ashland and Lancaster and places like that. They collect it all, even the business. So the ORC gives us that authority to do that. Same way with the sewer plant. Same way with perhaps providing EMS services or different things like that. So what our discussion needs to do, we need to back up a little bit and talk about those things from the service standpoint, break it down into its core parts and say, what do we want to do? And we still may want to regulate even the business side, the commercial dumpster side. We may not be providing the service. We may still want to not, we may come to some conclusion we're going to provide the residential service, but we still want to regulate it. And many places are doing that. I think what you're finding are townships and some cities that were never in the business. They made a public policy decision to say it's in our citizens' best interest for us to try to look at a larger volume and us, the city, to contract with one private hauler. We think we can get them better pricing, electric aggregation. Some cities have done that to try to save money for their citizens. That's the public purpose associated with that. Doesn't mean they have to pick up the trash, but they see that there's a need. There may be issues that the city as a whole, absent our citizens' best interests, see as important. Aesthetic issues. We don't want 2 or 3 different trucks rolling down. We want everybody to have their trash, whether we pick it up or not, out on the same day of the week, so it's not out there every day. Downtown, they have issues about, we don't want litter in our downtown areas. There are a number of different things, but I think what we really need to do, and in doing so, we'll address Mr. Price's issue, is go back a little bit and reconsider those issues and say, yes, this is why we feel we need to regulate, so control, and then ultimately you get to a point, when you start talking about the cost of service for us to provide it, that's a whole secondary issue, because we could regulate refuse service and make sure that it's just one provider. Whether we provide it or not is a different issue. In doing so, you start talking about the differences that Kent, you just brought up. Is there a more compelling reason for us to have a hauler in a residential area versus apartments? You look at right now, and there's businesses that have all kind of different haulers. Their trash tends to be in a place that's not right front and center on the street, and that's not problematic. Along that line, we ought to still consider, though, whether we still should be regulating in one way, shape, or form, because as we've talked many, many times, there are costs that we bear as a city. Some of them, the classic example is our landfills, which closed many, many moons ago. We haven't used them for a long time, but we've got this eternal obligation. And in the last couple of years, we spent a couple million, up to $1 million. We pass that along right now to just our residential customers, including apartment complexes, through our rates. The businesses out there, they don't pay that. And, that may be something to consider. But the issue becomes talking about, Bill said, the service, what level we should be in. Some of it will be pretty obvious. Some of it, there may be some policy discussions about that. But if we go back and we walk our way through that, it'll be a lot easier then to move to that next level. And who knows, ultimately, how we deliver the service. But I think you'll draw some conclusions that, yes, we're going to regulate, or no, or maybe we may say, apartment complexes, we'll allow that, but we still stay in the business is a different issue, because if some of those go away, it may not make sense for us to even provide dumpster service, but we may still want to have some means to regulate it. As I was looking at some of these other cities, that I could tell some of them that they don't provide the service, but they do regulate it, and all the commercial haulers have to get licensed. And, there's a process they go through that they can, and who knows, maybe assess some costs back, things like landfill, and then go down that route.
I know this came up with Upper Arlington. Did you research MD?
Please, that.
Upper Arlington, this came up with them 4 or 5 years ago, and they used to go, and they used to even have
They had behind home service, and
people didn't even have to put it on.
it was a hugely controversial issue in Upper Arlington. It caused a lot of issues in the community, but ultimately they said, we think there's a public purpose to regulating the service and maybe causing it to be provided, but we're going to get out of the business. And they did. And now they have a private hauler regulated by them.
And that may have been one of those issues at some point in their past. They felt so strongly about the aesthetic side that they were willing to pay a premium to have their employees go up to the door or the back door and pick it up, because they didn't want it sitting out in the front of their neighborhoods for people to see. Who knows? But they were willing to pay for that, and they passed that cost on to their citizens. Their citizens are willing to pay for it. Ultimately, they had some other challenge, because then they went to a bag system, and then you start talking about volume-based. But here, it wasn't just over 20. We've done it at least 2 times in the 26 years I've been here. Both times, though, was centered around, let's get proposals from the private sector, because, and it wasn't just apartment complex, it was residential. How much are people willing to pay? Are we, by us collecting, is that costing more? So if we go through the policy, we decided, yes, we clearly still want to regulate. That's one issue. And you can decide in that process, does that spill over to all, like some cities have? I mean, I could read from some of these cities. They do it all. And even the businesses, they have to pay for the dumpsters. They have to put them in a spot that the city can get access to. We may not. But ultimately, if you come down through that process, there's still that issue. Even if we do regulate it, do we provide it or not? That's a different costing issue, which again, you may want to tackle too, but you may not have to. That's where we've done a lot of legwork, somewhat because of Mr. Price's request, but really it's not so much that. What our information tells us is our allocation, not to get into old stuff, but for us to put a utility in place like this, we can't just charge whatever rates we want. They have to be indicative, of the cost for us to provide that service. And then there has to be an equitable methodology to allocate it to different users within your system. Can't charge everybody one base rate. That means, in our case, that we have dumpster cost charges. Then we have, a fixed amount for our residential, which it is pretty similar. Everybody pays the same per month, regardless of how much you put out sometimes. Although there is a volume base a little bit to it. But that issue, as we've looked at some of those informations, initially, if he's coming in and saying he can get it for half as much or a third as much, maybe. But our analysis says our rate methodology aren't out of whack. The cost of us providing that service is allocated pretty fairly across those. It makes sense. Ultimately, I don't know. Maybe the whole thing, that can have it done cheaper, but that's a separate discussion.
So I guess it comes down to what kind of changes, if any, since 1985, I'll say, do we have to make on 929?
Well, whether it's changes or whether you need to have the discussion to say, should we regulate it?
Should we? That's part of it.
Because that's what you don't have to. That says in there that we have to do it. We could just let the free, people take it. And so I think even though you start at that basic point, but gradually you get to the point where it's a little bit clearer what we do need to amend, if anything, perhaps nothing.
I guess for me personally, I'm all over the board on this because I'm trying to. So Mr. Price's facility, what is it? Just an apartment complex? Is it, or is it a senior?
It's apartment condominiums.
It used to be apartments converted to condos on Stratford Road. There's a bunch of them down there.
Okay, all right. And I guess I have a thought that when you build these things, whatever, you know what the rules. That you're going to be paying for city services. And you know them building in the city of Delaware. So then to come back after the fact with the free market thing, I struggle with that because what the rules were when you when you started your project in Delaware.
Right.
And then when I hear somebody say, well, I can get it for half price, whatever it may be, I mean, is that, I'm not saying it's not telling the truth, I'm just saying, have we seen that? Have we seen other rates? Do we know? And is that business 101 where this is a case where a independent business is trying to lowball pricing in order to start this whole controversy in order to build their bid to get in, you know what I mean? So I mean, I look at that angle too, maybe that's, he's gonna call it, I have no idea. But what I can't get my hand around is what are we ultimately trying to figure out here? Is it,
Whether you should, in this case, whether you should distinguish from a policy standpoint, what the difference between single-family residential units being required to provide this service versus a multifamily apartment complex, whether it's 3-family, 4-family, 5-family, 25-family.
To me, I think it only makes sense for the larger multi-unit. I mean, a 2-family or a 4-family unit is basically a residential unit on a city street. But when you get into apartment complexes where you've got a large number of units, to me, that's the point where it might make sense to have that discussion. I don't think because of somebody owns a 4-family that we should make that the one stop on the street that we don't pick up. I think what we're doing for the most part makes sense. And I think even if we decide we're going to permit large apartment complexes to have their own service, we should still regulate. We should still set standards for what that service should be. And that would prevent what Chris said, where you've got some fly-by-night company coming in and lowballing just to get the job. So all I'm saying is maybe it's worth looking at whether we would waive that for the larger multi-units.
and would that qualify as that Mr. Price he falls into that,
He'd fall in that category,
into the large,
as the other entities.
We don't necessarily label it 1, 2, 3, or 4 units. Really, do they use a dumpster or not? And, even that issue can be debatable.
Dumpster, then.
Right.
Yeah, they use dumpsters.
Okay.
That's
But,
correct.
you could have a 12-unit building that, they could use
Toters.
toters, but then they decide, well, we want to use dumpster. But to a certain extent, the policy becomes, is that a problem for us? Why? And to look at that, sometimes you might even have to look at the residential side and say, why wouldn't we go that same approach and let the market kind of drive that? Not just whether it's a different issue whether we provide that service. And again, what you do by having the discussion, and we need to quantify, because the issue will come up again. And I've been there long enough to know the same things keep coming back at us, and I think we just need to reiterate, here's the reasons why. Not just because, well, here's what we elected to do. We kind of let some people go if they wanted to or not. And if there is a compelling public purpose, not just to help out the citizens, that we want to, and the reasons what we want to regulate. And when you define those, you might find out that our desire to regulate these things really doesn't apply to apartment complexes or even the dumpster back there. So yes, we're comfortable saying they're not subject to it because of this. We could turn around and then there becomes a business side on our end, whether we get out of the dumpster bird business because it's different equipment and whatever else. At the same time that you do that and allow the market to drive, because we may have less of a concern. We've got this over, we probably should have a concern for our citizens, try to keep their costs for things like this as low as possible. For a business and the apartment owners, it's a business for them, even though there's residents that live there. It's just as much a business for them as it is for PPG or somebody else. They're kind of on their own, and if they pay whatever the market will pay, that might work to their advantage. There may be some apartment complexes, because we no longer provide the dumpster service, that when they go out, because of where they're located, they may have to pay more than the city's rates. Then they're going to be playing in the opposite direction.
Did we check any of the pricing that's out there? I know that was one of the concerns.
Most of the pricing comes from the entities. When they levy a complaint, they submit their quotes they get from different private haulers to us and say, here's what, Laidlaw or Rumpke will provide the same service for. And sometimes it's not the same. It's not an apples to apples comparison because they want to do it differently than how we do it. But why we do our service a certain way is because how we feel is the best, how it best meets the needs of that development without overflowing refuse containers and frequency of pickup, size, things like that. So it's just not a black and white issue as simple as it sounds. We should just let them have the lowest price because there's other things tied to this. the multifamily makes up the majority of our commercial service. If policy-wise, we felt that, if we just made the decision, let's just let the multifamily go because they can get it cheaper, that will impact our ability to maintain the rest of the commercial service we do need to maintain for downtown and our own service, to the point where it could impact those rates. It could impact that level of service. So stepping back to understand why we do what we do currently, I think it's important to really understand that before we can make the decisions to let any part of it go. So we understand the implications. We may come back and say we should expand it. I doubt it, but it's more likely to come back and say, well, maybe it made sense to regulate or to actually provide the service to multifamily 25 years ago, but it doesn't really seem to matter today. So we can opt not to do that. But we really ought to understand why we are where we are and what the implications are of letting part of that potentially go, or all of it go, before we make a decision.
So what's the next step then in getting that analysis done and coming back with, some feedback? I mean, how do we move this thing forward?
Well, like I mentioned, I think what we probably should do is go through the code, staff look at it and try to boil down our service positions on different areas of the code, on refuse, residential, on commercial, major level of service conditions and things that are linked. Try to boil down our service into some understandable points, discussion points to consider. So you know the pros and cons of certain things and some of the give and take if you were to let something go or change something, and start from there. In terms of who, if it's this body or if it's a Public Works Committee body to talk that, we can start bringing back that outline. At the same time, if there's things right off the top of your head to say, this is really important to me when it comes to the service, it'd be helpful to know that so we can bring that information, how it relates to our overall revenue policy, to that first meeting. And I think we can bring back an outline of what we think is our service policies today, why we do things, and use that as a starting point.
And it's really just a bunch of them. We could probably think of some policy-related issues, and start listing them out, and we just need to weed our way through them. It's relative, it's not. At some point, it may be, whether it's this committee or council as a whole, saying, we don't see that as being something we need to control. But the only way you can get started is just, you might start with some stuff that seems to be pretty basic, but again, gradually you work your way through. And I think you'll see, you do that, to take that time.
Start to paint a picture of how our refuse service exists.
Part of that may be, now it's not just rates. I think you need to set aside what we charge, try to stay focused on it, but it may be looking like I did today, although we tend to just look in the general vicinity, but you go look at other communities. We find out we've looked at a lot of communities across the state of Ohio, similar somewhat to us, outside of an urban area a little bit and whatever else. Nobody picks up residential waste, or they don't regulate, they don't control that. That in and of itself, I don't know, to some people that may say, why should we, what's different about Delaware? But we'll try to, as much as we can. You might think about it from your own perspective and say, what is it that, are there some reasons why, as a governmental entity, we need to stay in control of this?
I guess the next question is realistically the time to do this type of thing. With our budget process having just started with the directors, I would almost ask for consideration to have us present this after the budget is presented to you. It's just
First of the year.
It's just like, there's just one more. I mean, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it's time that Bill's got to spend, staff, input from us. And
That makes sense. Seems up to me.
Yeah, first quarter. Bill, have you taken into consideration what effect this would be if we do make a change and let them privatize it? How much less time is your people going to have, equipment-wise, man-hour-wise?
To some extent, we've looked at just overall impact of just rate. I mean, obviously we'll have an impact because some of the people we have there in our overall refuse operations spill over and help out the commercial, but you can't, but they're also part of the residential. So we have to spend some real time to seriously look at the financial bottom line. That would really become after we look at the bigger policy issue. What should our cost be? Even though we have separate accounts for recycling and refuse collection, the staff is co-mingled throughout the thing, as is the equipment and the days we collect. So it's very joined together, the service. So trying to separate out to talk about policy is going to take some time. So you can see how making an adjustment for this policy here could impact even our residential policies and residential rate structures. We want to make sure we break it down to start with into simple, understandable points. So then we can build back up, Joe, and answer your questions in terms of what would this mean manpower wise, or do we need more or less equipment? Would it impact collection time and timeframes, things like that? So we can get to those answers, but I think we should probably start at the high level, at the policy, and let that drive what the final picture is going to look like. And then we can definitely compare to how does that contrast to where we are today with different things within our service.
I think for me, moving forward, I think we raised 2017 type issue, but I think one of you guys said about, some thoughts to keep in the back of your mind, and Dean get it right, I read that down, and he said it was kind of freaky that you brought it up, but, every action is a reaction, and so if this gets privatized, then is it we get the push from residential, and it's going to be privatized, and then my concern is exactly what he said, you got a long street that has 5 different people home, doing trash, and you constantly have trash cans,
Right. Unless,
No
right.
system, no
Unless
system.
the system was, we're out of the business, but we're going to still regulate it. We're going to do what Genoa, Liberty, and Powell did, or
Yeah, if we
Genoa.
got out of it, we'd have to regulate.
And I think you'll probably find in our community survey that most people, I think the service is pretty good. It's pretty well delivered, and it's a reasonably fair price. You get the recycling and all of that, so.
And I think one of the last times what surprised us, because I thought people thought of it as a commodity, it's kind of cable service. Would you pay $19 for this level of service or $15 for the same level of service, but provided by somebody other than the city? More on the high majority, a surprisingly high majority, we said, no, we'd rather the city do it because we can talk to our council members. They envision all the issues that can crop
Right,
up, and they're willing to pay a premium
My
for it.
neighbor collects, he's one of the collectors, it's his job,
Right.
absolutely.
Right, and
It's a community.
there's that piece of it as well.
But ultimately, that
That's-
becomes a business side of whether we do it. Even if we don't, we probably, but maybe not, probably going to still want to regulate it. And, even the issue as far as the apartment complexes and carving them out, there can be cause and effect type of things. We've had requests for a long time to provide recycling services because many of the people living in these apartments are environmental people. They don't have a direct means of recycling. So if we provide means outside of a private hauler, is that fair if they're not paying for recycling? Because our single family houses, people want to do it, but it costs us money to recycle. And so, as you work through these issues, you have to consider, and we'll try to identify as many as we can to say what some of the implications may be. But
In my time on council, this subject's come up many times, and each time we run a survey or we ask our constituents, they always said they like what the city's doing, don't touch it, as far as residential.
But to me, the issue at hand is not,
Well, this is-
you take us out of the trash business. The issue at hand is, can we consider large multifamily complexes, can we consider allowing them to opt out? That's to me, I don't think
right.
that I want to talk about us not being a trash pickup in residential streets.
Yeah.
What I'd like to know is, does this make sense for us or not? And what are the implications if we do something?
But at some point, that is secondary, whether we're doing it. But at some point, you might say, you should also talk about the residential, because we also get complaints from people about our service costs. And so along with, I think you ought to cover the whole area. And maybe, I think the easy one's going to be, we'll find is large apartment complexes, because it's hard to come up with some reasons why we need to stay in that, other than the impact on the rest of our system.
Right.
That in and of itself, and that does get down to the numbers, because we've got less, customers out there to pass some overhead costs that are fixed.
Right.
If we go build a building, now we're passing it along, 10,000 customers, and all of a sudden we have 8,000 customers, our per unit costs are going to go up. Does that impact, the issue about whether we should or shouldn't, or, let the private sector, so ultimately, you try to quantify as much of that as you can. Certainly, if you do that, we're reasonably successful in documenting that a little bit for historical purpose. It makes it a lot easier when these people deal with these issues on a day in, day out basis, and these people call about it and say, hey, there was some discussion. And here was, we can even send you a copy of the conclusions they drew. And it's
I think too, now at 17, you're gonna have to come up with the amount of these units and who owns them, to give us a overall picture of what are we talking about? Are we talking about 2 or 3?
Well, how many?
Yeah, we've got that in detail right now. Each location, owner, number of units there, We tend to talk about things in terms of how many cubic yards per month we're picking up at different units, or how many service calls we're making per month. So, but we have a full breakdown of that. It's already in the system, and we can provide that information as well to show just the number of properties we're talking about this particular issue. And I think it's 80. I think it's 83. It depends. It changes.
83
as
actual
more come on.
dumpsters or
Property locations.
Well, I'm like, Ken, I don't want the 2-unit, 4-unit ones. I want just like the one over on Stratford, those type of units.
Then you have to distinguish at some point,
What is
what is a commercial
Yeah.
apartment complex?
And I think
versus-
that has to be defined initially also.
Yeah, it's quantified as 3,394 units, or residential units we're talking about total.
Attached units.
That's units, combination condominiums and apartment rentals. So
this is, how do you quantify Wesleyan?
they would be,
Each dorm?
each dorm would have its own. Oh, no, Wesleyan is under commercial, as Wesleyan as an entity, a business entity itself.
So we don't consider that to be residential.
Right. But we've got 292 services per week. So of those units, we're stopping by in the services every time we touch a dumpster. So in a given week, we're making 292 stops for just a multifamily to pick up their dumpsters. Some it's 5 days a week, some it's once a week. But we have that all broken out in many different ways.
Stratford and his complex, is that broken out? Is that part of that 292? Obviously it is,
Yeah.
but how many?
Old Tangy View Apartments, he's got 110 units there, 10 6-yard dumpsters. We pick it up once a week, all 10, for a total of 60 yards picked up per week at that location. So we're servicing him once a week. Yeah,
Almost half of it's his.
One of the interesting things that Bill did share today was they went back and they kind of looked at the number of residence units there and the cost of that service, and it compared it to like our single family. If our single family people pay $19.63 a month. Well, residential unit, some of those apartment complexes.
the average for all of our residential is $11.55
And
per
our
month.
costs. So not that that's right or wrong, but that kind of puts it in a little context. So maybe, but you can question whether they're going to, somebody's lowballing this, but at some point, that's all we're charging Old Tangy Views for those residents. When we look at it from our residents' standpoint, they are getting a pretty good price break because again, they have to walk and put it in a dumpster, so they ought not pay the same,
Okay.
So in terms of when to report back to finance, do you want to keep this before finance at this point, Joe? And just,
That's I'm debating on.
I mean, I don't know, once we pull together the report, I think it could be the full council. It doesn't, I mean, it's really ultimately
I would think we probably should review it prior to going.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, it's really got two kind of impacts. One is the operational stuff is Public Works.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah,
financial impact
dollars
is.
and nickels and dimes in the finance. Yeah, I'd even come back to us in January or February. I wouldn't, I take your time on it. It's nothing I don't think we're gonna.
I think in terms of the formal request, I think we do owe Old Tangy View condominium an answer, which currently we've reviewed it and there's no provision for that. And however, the city will be evaluating its code and the beginning of next year,
We'll respond.
at some point, if you make any changes, it's going to require public hearings and public input, so they have a chance at that point. But I think they, at some point, want an answer.
Right.
Right, I think that's the answer.
The answer right now is we'd have
The
no.
code only allows for unusual and extraordinary
And we don't believe that's
circumstances.
an
And the cost isn't that, but we're going to look at our methodologies and our policies system-wide, not just for Old Tangy View. We're going to consider this whole system as a whole, and that may or may not be changed, that requirement.
February.
Right.
That's not gonna happen until February.
Right.
Yeah,
That's the answer.
so
You're
gonna be in February 1st?
Yeah, you want February 1st, we'll set up the finance.
yeah, we'll just say February 1st, we'll have something back to you.
Yeah, so that's a meeting's date.
Yeah, we'll set a date.
Okay.
I'll have Michelle.
That's reasonable.
But you'll get back to them as far as.
We'll give them a
letter-
formal letter.
letter
We'll copy
stating-
council that we've reviewed it
Reviewed it.
internally and with finance committee. I don't think it needs to, it's really not a legislative decision. Right now it's administrative, and in our opinion that they don't meet that unusual.
And I'd like to
circumstance.
send that to the other two property owners as well.
Yeah, and I think at the same time, Bill, we'll just let them know what we're going to be doing, and beginning of next year, that might result in some changes.
Okay. Very good. Any other comments from the committee? Does that satisfy you? Item 3 is discussion of proposed cemetery ordinance, chapter 146. And I believe you also got a copy of that.
And this again is a really more of a policy discussion, not a whole lot in some regards, different than the refuse discussion. I did have some information I provided you, but not with the intent of pouring through it, but I think we'll kind of touch on that a little bit. Like I mentioned with the refuse system, the Ohio Revised Code gives us the authority to regulate cemeteries in the city, not just ours, but all of them. You know, so there becomes a policy decision. What does that mean? If you read the paper, you've read stuff about the Galena, and they finally got the decision. It's Galena's responsibility. Well, there's some case law, and you start looking at that. There are regulations out here a little bit several years ago with the mausoleum. Privately, we had to deal with that. So again, now you have a situation of we have the authority, and quite frankly, we have the responsibility. How do we regulate cemeteries? And you know, obviously things changed here a lot more 2-3 years ago when we took over the Oak Grove Cemetery. So one of these issues becomes, again, where do you start out and what do you codify? What sort of regulations do you put in place? Are they regulations? Are they policies? Are they things that you want to codify and put in your codify ordinance and say it has some basis there that we need to, you know, have it in an ordinance form? So going down that process, tried to get Darren to kind of look at getting the ball rolling, and he provided, and it's the thing that has the memo from Darren first, and then he attached kind of a first go round of looking at putting ordinance legislation in place related to our cemetery. And it's the basics. If you look at Darren's memo, I think is somewhat of the issue where you really got to get down into the policy side, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It says, here's a draft cemetery ordinance I came up with based on David's meeting with Dean, Ted's email, conversions with Tom. Just for the record, that Ted's email was because Ted's going to be the one ultimately responsible for everything at the cemetery. So it's, he went those here. Just kidding.
You can see, I'll tell him he's really excited.
What it says based on David. Who's David?
David's the other attorney we hired to help us with city things, and
David Mosier.
Mosier says, note that I took the approach of granting authorities to staff to make rules. Okay, now again, that in and of itself sounds innocuous, but here we've got an issue that we were regulating, not just cemeteries in general, but what goes on in these cemeteries and how. So we have to consider that. It says, in looking at Marysville's code is way too complicated. Also, it is more difficult to change codes than rules. This draft does state that fees, et cetera, will be included in the fee schedule. So we'd have to get our list of that ready as part of the budget.
Does line 3 mean that Marysville's code is too complicated or our code is too complicated?
No, Marysville's,
Okay.
at least in Darren's opinion. Now, so what we want to kind of go through a little bit here tonight, and this is one of these things that we'll probably have some further discussion, but we need to consider that role that we play, not just in providing a service, because quite frankly, we could contract out the administration of our cemetery if we wanted to, just like refuse. But what and how we're going to regulate and what means we're going to use to do that. Again, Darren attached, and this is just very, very basic. There's plenty of cities out there that operate cemeteries. I didn't pass them around, but here's Marysville's, that he considers to be a little bit more complicated. This is the city of Brunswick, Ohio, all their code sections related to cemetery. Different places do it in different ways, but primarily what you're talking about from a cemetery standpoint, there's a situation where there's state law. ORC has provisions about doing different things. We had an example that came up a week or so ago about disinterring a body. We come to find out that we went to probe a space out there for somebody thinking there wasn't anybody buried there. And we always probe, literally like it sounds, with a rod down in there, and they found a vault. They hit something. We don't think anybody's, well, then we went back through, and it ultimately had to do with two people, a son of a mom and a dad, and then whatever else. Mom and dad died in the 60s. Dad was buried in the right place. Then mom died in 69. And ultimately, at some point there, they put the headstone on the wrong two lots. So anyways, it got messed up. It ended up that the daughter-in-law was buried beside the father. And so when the son died, family expecting him to be buried by mom, well, so we had to disinter the father, grandfather to some, move him over a space. But there are state law, there's regulations about how you do or don't do that. And so when it comes to our regulations, and there may be times where we're going to actually, in our codified ordinance, perhaps defer to the Ohio Revised Code. There may be reasons where we want to, not so much in that case, but in others, establish our own. One of the big issues with the cemetery and things that come up on an ongoing basis, there's all kind of processes. And I know Joe spent a little bit of time on the Oak Grove Cemetery board. A lot of it has to do just with what people after the fact can do with these their burial places. Can you put shepherd's hook? Can you put fences? Can you do all this sort of stuff? But there's a number of different related issues. What I've also handed out, and again, you don't have to worry about pouring through it tonight, is when it was operated, this cemetery by Oak Grove, the city wasn't directly involved. They had regulations. What I don't have, they basically had two sets of regulations. I talked to Carol, at some point we've got to figure out the difference between the two, but they had these rules and regulations that dealt with burying people, selling the lots, reselling the lots, all that stuff with the whole process of getting somebody interred. That's one. And then the other was more the maintenance and upkeep and what do you do? Can you plant flowers? And since we took over, we really didn't fundamentally change any of those processes. We tried to pull them together in documents that are a little more, easier to follow. But so what we have out there is some regulations. Some of them that we include in the listing are just reiterating or including Ohio Revised Code issues. But it can run the gamut from, when somebody actually buys a lot out there, they get a deed, but they don't own it. They own the right to inter somebody, and that's it. But many times they don't use them. I had just as an example, I had an email that this was from 2013. So we had taken over, but it's from Joe, or ultimately it was from Joe to Darren, but he brought up, says, and this is from Darren to me, it says, Joe received a question from a constituent who apparently wants to sell his or her plot to someone else. The constituent was instructed that he or she would have to sell it back to us as opposed to selling it directly to someone else. And Darren said, I did some legal research and couldn't get an answer as to whether this was permissible or not. But our deeds do say that the plot is to be used for burial, and case law says that is a different purpose than profiting from it. I also noted that our deeds say that they own it pursuant to policy, so I figured it was worth checking to see if you're aware of any written policies. It's not so much that issue per se, but there's just a lot of gray area.
Come up.
And it comes up quite frequently. And ultimately, what we have in our policy here and what we've been doing since we've operated is we don't allow people to sell them on the open market. We've been buying them back. We've bought back probably 15, 18 spaces in the last couple years, and we pay for them. There's actually a business side to why that might make sense on our part, but keep in mind, some of these were bought 40, 50 years ago, and they just never used it for grandma. She got buried someplace else. What do I do with it? I want to do something. We have a compelling reason to keep track of that, because we have a lot of, we got limited space out there, and, it doesn't do us any good to not have people buried. We want to make sure that they're actually being used for that. But it's not so much that issue as it is that a policy that we decide? Is it a rule? Is it something we want to codify? And so there's a number of different issues related to that. One of the big, and I've looked at some other cities and how they handle that. Some of them do it differently. Whether we allow people that specific issue of reselling their lots or not and to profit from it, we still need to know, because what happens all too frequently, it's not as clear, because some of these things are years and years in the making. Somebody shows up there. Well, this is Aunt Jane. We want to bury her on our family's space out there. Okay, which one? Well, I don't know. You got to kind of piece back through to figure out what right do they have. We come to find out that the actual space was bought by somebody else many, many years ago. And do we just allow them to bury somebody in there? Sometimes there's not differences in years. Check, see if they're at the meeting or not, or.
Which meeting are you for?
To get married?
What, no, it's like Sarah's class, they go.
Oh, okay, you're here for
okay.
finance committee, okay.
We're in the finance committee and now we're talking about the cemetery.
Interesting stuff. So, we'll have things come in that are just recent. The people come in here, well, this people got divorced. We want to use this space. And then we start, who do we or who don't we? All we can deal with is who originally, so there's some issues related to that. The bigger, and this is just the starting to have some forum to discuss these a little bit, is at I'll call it an administrative level. What are we going to codify or not codify? What are we going to regulate specifically, or what are we just going to delegate it down? And if we do delegate it down, i.e., and we don't put it in a codified form, who decides these things? And kind of like Parks and Rec and whatever else, people have opinions about what should or shouldn't be done out of that cemetery. And so that comes up quite a bit. Right now, since we took over, we no longer have the Oak Grove Board of Trustees or whatever to kind of be a sounding board. It becomes Carolyn, or these things pop up occasionally. It's not just whether we committed it to writing. Everybody wants an exception, or everybody has a little bit different version of something. One of the key things that I think we can talk a little bit about, and I want you to think about is, and I know Chris had some concerns a little bit a couple weeks ago, is about this notion, and many communities have them, is an advisory. Is it like a committee of council, a cemetery committee? Do we want to, is it rise to that level that we need a committee of council like we do with our airport to talk about these issues that come up and have a citizen, the citizens have the ability to have a sounding board. It's not one of us city employees making all the decisions. And if we do, what form should that take? Should it be a committee of citizens? Should they be advisory? Should they have some other authority to do some things? And how we formulate that. So at this point, we just kind of want to begin the discussion about some of those policy related issues. Having a citizen advisory, there's other reasons why. One of the things we lost when the city took over is that committee, they did a lot with fundraising. They were that, they could play that role of the citizens, because it's basically the citizen cemetery. We just happen to be the ones responsible to have to take care of it. And you probably still want that. You need to find some way to inject that into the system. Just to keep rambling on, I also passed out to you, there was a listing that Carolyn and John's our primary maintenance person out there at the cemetery, put together, just kind of quantifying a little bit.
Things to address.
Things are addressed with.
Right, you see that? And, there's no real rhyme or reason. Yes, it's one page, and at the top it says things to address. Maintenance issues, and you can kind of read through these. The simple thing, ultimately, maybe we address this someday when we look comprehensively at the site. Shrubs, can people plant them there? Can they not? What if they do? Do they have to maintain them? What if they get overgrown? Can we just pull them out? When you start doing some of those things, then somebody shows up 2 months, 2 years later, who took the beautiful bush off my mother's grave, and why? But there's a number of them listed here. Enforcement rules, oftentimes it comes up, and it was this way with Oak Grove. They had these regulations, but for one reason or another, they didn't always enforce them. So then you end up in this, which I know from being in the public sector, if you're going to regulate people, you better be as consistent as you can, because otherwise you're pretty much, you're just winging it. And so it's not just whether we need to adhere to them, what's the process by which we do that? And if it's people like Carolyn or John on the front line dealing with these these issues, it's such to say, can we say, just like we did tonight on Mr. On the refuse apartment complex, well, here's what our ordinance says. Now, maybe there's an appeal process of something, and you can ultimately go to somebody outside a city employee, but those are the things that we need to get our hands around. I hate to say it because most people don't like the government regulating things, but I don't think we have any option in this case. we need to have some sort of a process in place. And what we'd like to do is Darren has kind of begun the process with that draft, but I think we're going to perhaps have to fine tune that a little bit more. And I'd throw it out there tonight because it's kind of hard to go to a forum to at least start this discussion. There are the policy sides of it, the public sides of it that we really need, I think, some council people, and maybe you talk to some people out there. I know Joe could provide some input, and maybe even some of the other people that have been involved in the cemetery in the past, and say, so you can get a little bit of a sense that, yes, here's how we think this somewhat should be governed, although ultimately the city and city council is ultimately responsible. But here are some of those things. Here's how we want to lay those out.
But any legislation regarding Oak Grove, who would it then entail? All cemeteries in the city?
Well, right now, I mean, with the only one that we.
I'm not saying this if we go to regulate it.
If we wanted to, we could say that cemetery at the corner of Houck Road and Central should be under our. We should be able to.
St. Mary's, which is right.
Well, that one Houck Road is ours, but there's not much activity going on, and the people they're buried so long ago. I don't even know that there's next of kin that we would even be dealing with, so it's pretty much ours.
St. Mary's.
St. Mary's is one of those. And again, I think we ought to make it clear, because again, if we cite a section of revised code that says the city, and I saw one of these communities, one of the first things they did, it says, section such and such of the Ohio Revised Code authorizes the city to regulate any and all cemeteries and burial grounds and whatever else in there. We're responsible. Talk to Galena. So they take that on, and then within that codified ordinance, then you provide a means to say that we can, there may be others, we need to be aware of it, whether they need to get a license. You hate to go that route, but we're going to have some or not, and maybe we indicate specifically by cemetery, because I've seen that in some other cities
Can you do that
where they
with
say that we're going to authorize administration, regulations of whatever else of St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery to this entity. And, it's not something that changes a lot. Over time.
I don't think, to me, I think what gave rise to this principally was that we're now, we own and operate this cemetery, and there are a lot of issues that come up, and we got to decide how to deal with those. It's now an operation of the communities of ours. We've been charged with it.
I just don't see, because we have to, if we regulate that it affects all cemeteries.
No, I think we would.
Right, we would exempt them, but I think we should reference that in here.
Yeah, you would say that, these regulations pertain to Oak Grove Cemetery or all cemeteries with the exception of, we're right in some way, but I don't think we.
Right, and other cities have done that. I can look at some of these and say, right here, it's Marysville, Oakdale Cemetery, St. John's Catholic Cemetery. They have an actual section in there, and I'm sure they probably say, it's theirs, they're doing this, blah, blah, blah. Who knows? It could go defunct someday, and it could become the city's. But, so there might be some part of that, but who knows? It may be very basic that says these regulations do not apply to St. John's Catholic Cemetery.
When we inherited Oak Grove, it was because it was in the city limits of Delaware that the municipality has to assume that responsibility.
Carolyn, you were with Oak Grove for a number of years, obviously, before we took the cemetery over. What's your perspective on this in terms of just the kind of the day-to-day operational issues that come up? And you probably need to
probably come up to the
you have to
microphone,
come up
Carolyn.
here. Because you transitioned really from
I
Oak
told her before the
Grove.
meeting she'd have to do that.
Have you met Ken and?
Yeah.
I met Chris on the way up the steps.
Okay.
I think we introduced you at a council meeting, didn't
Yeah,
we? Several years ago.
A few years back.
Yeah.
yeah.
Because it's been how long now since we?
Well, I started in 13, but we took over the cemetery in 2012, November 1st of 12. So,
It's 4
4
years.
years.
Four
so
years.
it's been 4 years. So, but I guess Dean and I have discussed a lot of what he has talked about. And it is hard from that day-to-day perspective. We get so many questions from the public, and it's hard to regulate. It's hard to say fencing, do we allow it, do we not allow it? But we don't allow it in our rules, but we don't enforce it. So and that's why there's really a need to either codify or at least set some sort of rules and regulations in place. It will make my job just out of that gray and say, you know, hey, I'm sorry, this is our rules and this is why we put this in place. Whether it's a maintenance issue, the fencing issue that came up, they, you know, had points on them. They were tall, they were unsafe, you know, so we look at that type of stuff as well. But there is a need for us to be able to fall back as staff and say, you know, this is what council has decided, this is what we put in place, and this is what we, you know, we need to follow. But then again, I also want the public to have that opportunity to appeal to someone when there is something maybe is not black and white,
Something questionable.
right?
I mean, I think, yeah, just from my standpoint, establishment of the rule, I mean, we distinguish between what should be done administratively, what should be done legislatively, and in terms of setting up rules, I would almost say that we could propose the rule and have council review them. I'm not sure, though, that every time we want to change a rule, we come to city council.
No, it should be.
But on the other hand, if you say somebody feels as though the rule isn't fair, then there's some sort of a process that they can appeal it in some way. But
One of the things related to that, I
Was
think
that committee?
when you get down to it, and a committee can play a role with some of the stuff, but I think we should look at some of these rules and regulations, because we may find that some of them perhaps we do need to codify, because, you know, it's not a matter of it black and white what the situation is, but how do they enforce it? And I'm not saying there's many of those, but it may be something that does clearly need to be more than just something that's a regulation that we do. It's always tough when you do this, especially if you go back and change things. What about everybody that had a picket fence before? Everybody had a shrub. So from a policy standpoint, it gets into that. And yes, you can have an advisory committee, but they may not be as attuned to the ramifications of policies. They may just look at it on the surface and say, yeah, why not? So, you know, it becomes, like Carolyn said, there clearly is helpful to have a sounding board, because she can understand it and say it, but just like Mr. The apartment complex owner, he wants some means. Bill could have told him a long time ago and probably did. I don't see your issue as an extraordinary thing that warrants making an exception. People need to and want to have some other avenue. Is that a citizens committee? Is it like I said, a committee of council? Even if you don't codify your rules and regulations, any of them, there still needs to be some means to address some of them.
Well, there also are some rules and regulations that within the cemetery are not bendable. Like you must have a vault. I mean, that's just, you know, and it has to be a certain type of vault. For a few years, one of the funeral directors in towns were selling polypropylene. Well, we all know when you go to probe the ground for a polypropylene vault, we found out real quick, your probe goes right through them. So, you know, we had to ban them from the cemetery. But there are just certain things that we have in black and white that, you know, there are reasons why they need to be on the books.
How far back do our records go on the purchasing of plots like the one I brought up? And do we sell them at the purchase price, or we sell them at the selling price of what's happening?
We have records of all of our deeds clear back to 1851,
Okay,
when
just
they
for our
originally
purpose.
purchased. The ones that you were talking about, I don't recall how old they were, but I mean, we do have a price. They were,
I'd say it's 30 years.
yeah, but I mean, they may have, you know, at that time maybe been sold for $300 or $400. But we have put a policy in place.
And again, this was
for
done
repurchasing.
basically, from my standpoint, looking at it from a business perspective. But again, the records do go back when we took it over. First thing, I mean, they're in all these binders and books and cards. We're close. We contracted, if you're familiar, put money in the budget. We bought some, it's called Legacy Mark software to get all this stuff into digital form so we can sustain it and all that sort of stuff and build on it. It's not operational yet. It'll probably be several months yet, but we're pretty close. It's been a long process. But that buying and selling, And what we ultimately decided is, again, there's a market, so we have a minimum amount that we'll pay, and up to a maximum amount, but there's enough room in there that when we turn around, and I had brought the information to say how many we've done, and you give me a
What's the
second.
plot now cost, 1,100?
It's $1,000 for an
$1,000.
upright section and $950 for the section where all the markers are flush to the ground.
We have, I think there's one pending here, but with what Carolyn, I had her put a summary together a couple of months ago. We've since 2014, we've purchased 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 or more lots repurchased. Again, prior to us taking over, the Oak Grove Association didn't, because they didn't want to pay back the money. They didn't want to pay anything out. It was all they could do to pay their bills. But several of these we've turned around and resold. So one of them, as an example, it was in Valley View. A lot was bought in 2004. They paid $750 when they originally purchased it. We bought it back in 2015. We gave them $650. I don't know what the percentage is. It like 80% up to, but a minimum of 500 or something like
75.
75.
With a minimum of 500.
Right, a minimum of 500. So we paid $650, but we turned around and resold that same lot in July of 2016 for $1,000. So from a business standpoint, not only do we control and make sure there's not a secondary market, but we didn't want to just take it away. Some of these were much older than that. Here's one in 1968. It was purchased. They paid $87.50 for it. So we paid $500, the minimum amount, because we know it's worth $1,000. And plus it provides a means for people to sell them back for it. If that's me and I've got it for $87.50 and we're only gonna, I'd almost say I'm not even gonna bother with it. We'll just keep that lot. Who knows, someday it may. So it helps us to say we can get some of those, because we're pretty much very limited in our ability. There's no open lots out there, not many. It's one of the things we have to do with looking at some master planning. So we've got to open up some new sections. Because I was surprised, it was a year or so ago where Carolyn says, we really don't have,
Not that many.
there's not many to sell. And we could be selling more, but we just don't have any spaces. And some of the ones we have, the spaces in the areas aren't as, maybe we need to do something more to make them a little bit more attractive. But anyways, so that's how that worked. But again, that became an issue that we talked about. It would certainly help to have a sounding board. And we could say it's going to be the finance committee, and we could have these rules and regulations. But I think what you're going to find is there's just it's a little bit more involved. Plus, I think it's helpful to get the citizens back involved. Like I mentioned earlier, in the past, they used to get donations. They would have people, when we took over, people every year would donate money, that not because just because they want to see that place kept well. And we could probably leverage some of that. We could leverage through the citizens committee that they can be that personal element to it, that they could go out and people in the community have a means that they could be a part of it. And a lot of people care about that cemetery in a lot of different ways. And we just want to make sure it doesn't become some bureaucratic process that here at City Hall, these things happen. So, but along with that, even whether we do or however we approach that, we do need to clarify a little bit more what we're going to codify, what we're not. Even if we don't, I think we have to have some formal means to adopt these regulations, and it shouldn't be just, I was kind of picking on Carolyn today. She did make a couple of changes that Carolyn decided she wants to change this, so she changed it. We need to have something a bit more than that.
Well, it gives her, if we were able to set the rules and regulations and codify them, it gives her something to work with and have a little bit of meat in the process. Ted, you're quiet. What do you think?
I reiterate everything they said. From the maintenance standpoint, it's the same thing, having the rules and regulations to back us up on some of those things and also enforcing them. So.
I know Tom and I have discussed this about the committee and the citizens.
Yeah,
committee
it's
a couple years
we
now.
You have a Parks Board. That's really, you could say, is that can the Parks Board play that role? Perhaps, but that's, it's typically not even though it is a park-like setting, it's not a park in the sense that our other parks are. So
ultimately, we may
makes no
find,
sense here, but
and this gets, I think, an issue Chris raised, if we can't engage the right people, and all we do is struggle to get people appointed to this cemetery board of whatever form it takes, then, we need to perhaps consider that, because, it could be city council or a committee of council. You'd like to think, that there could be a bit more citizen engagement, because it is the citizens' cemetery out there. And but at some point, we've got to start that process and find out. And I think reaching out to council members to get your viewpoints on the policy side is this first step.
Ken and Chris, any comments? We can beat this like a dead horse all night, but I think we have to have a starting point.
I think it makes sense to have some type of committee form, but I agree with the comments. The public needs to have input into this. And of course, a lot of it's going to come from you because you've been doing this and you know some of the things that are important and where you'd like to see them go. So I think at some point we have to put together some kind of group that will help us decide this. And then whether we need to codify all of them or just codify something that gives authority to whomever to,
I was on that committee because it's in the 3rd ward. And,
How many people on that committee then, Joe?
there were
That was big.
There are 15 on there.
15. at one
This would be
point.
3 to 5.
Well, there were-
I thought I saw somebody said 11. I think 11 is what you mentioned.
Yeah, I'd say no more than 7.
I think 7, I think 3 to
I
5.
think 3 to 5.
Yeah.
You know, it's just hard to get.
Because when you get that many people, then people are like, well, they don't, if I don't go, they won't, they'll have enough people for quorum. Next thing you know, there's 3 people there, and they don't have a quorum, and, right.
I know the civil service, we only have 3. So,
Carolyn, from your just experience, you think there's an interest in folks who,
What, in being on
the
the
community,
committee?
being involved in something like that?
Absolutely, I do. I mean, even Joe will tell you, we get input all the time. And I know as a councilman, he did, from the public. It is, or shall I say, was started as a public cemetery where the lot owners actually, at one point originally, had access to the board and had a forum yearly where they could come as a lot owner and say, this is the way we want it run.
And that's what's going to change with us now, kind of assuming the role.
Right.
You have veterans groups, you have any number of other different people that have interest in what occurs out there at that cemetery, not just the look, but even events and things like that. We had one that we kind of unknowingly kind of got caught in the middle of. It was actually St. Mary's Cemetery wanting to do a All Saints Day event out there, but they had to access the site. They had to come through our entrance phase, and then they're coming in with some version of a parade or whatever it was.
That's cool.
They're doing hay rides.
Hay rides and stuff like that.
November
Well, then we
1st.
get all these complaints from people on the Oak Grove side saying, I can't believe how tacky is that to allow a hayride to go past my father's grave or whatever it is. And so you're always going to have a certain amount of that, but different people have different opinions about how, what, when, where, and why.
that's still November 1st, All Saints Day.
So, but we're sitting there, it's like, oh my gosh, you kidding? Okay.
Day after Halloween. So what do you think? I think probably it should be a discussion for you and the mayor as far as a committee and establishing a committee the first of the year. Again, we're kind of tied down right now.
Well, the process, and I think where we need to perhaps go is if you may want to just talk to a couple of people. What do you think? And Carolyn can give your input. Just if you get a chance, talk to some citizens and maybe ask a couple of your council members, what are their thoughts on it? Because we can come back and we can use, I know Darren wants to keep it simple, and that's okay, but we can prepare something. There's plenty of cities out there that have cemeteries that have advisory committees and have a board of trustees, some of them do. So there's any number of different ways we can approach that. That's pretty easy, putting it together. Now, getting the committee in place and how Ted's going to do that. He may be busy, but I think doing that side of it. But I think at this point, to get this process rolling, because we are kind of not so much in limbo, but this sooner than later it would help to make the job a little bit more manageable on our part. So right now, if you can kind of maybe just reach out and maybe you might find out some things out there related to that might help you say, yeah, I think we got people and we want to delegate some authority to them.
We'd come back and we would propose legislation that would establish
That
that.
committee.
Yeah, and provide what their duties are going to be, but maybe just discuss it amongst yourselves and with your constituents.
I know I have discussed it with a couple of the ex-committee members. And unfortunately, it's like me and them, we're all on all committees. And so how do you book it in, you know, as far as another meeting?
It'd be nice to have a range of,
Yeah,
you know, just because you have, well, you know, things are changing in terms of that how we provide the service.
Maybe we can have a virtual committee. That's the next thing down the road, so we can put it out there to people. We don't have to have a committee member, but we can, through Facebook, whatever else, we get input from the citizenry. Who knows, maybe someday.
Well, I will say one of the nice things about getting the public involved is Tom brought up a good point. The funeral industry is changing. People, you
People
know,
are electing for conventional burials.
yeah, when I
right?
started almost 13 years ago, we saw a few cremations. Now the funeral homes are telling me that 50% of the people are being cremated. We're seeing about 30% of them come through our door are cremated.
and the question I had, and I hadn't even
How do you lay your
posed it-
cemetery
No,
out?
well, I haven't posed it yet. If you buy a double plot, husband and wife, the husband does want cremated, the wife wants cremated, can she be buried on top of the husband? And then you have the other plot for somebody else.
Yes.
Actually, what we have
That's a
does
question.
address that, because it does say that if you have a burial with a vault, you're allowed to put one cremains above that.
And on top of it.
But you have to get your wife's approval or your husband's approval before, the wife can't do it unless the husband signed off before he died and said, I want her buried on top. No. But, and could you sell the other site? Well, you could,
Yeah.
back to the city.
Back to the city or to another
Sure.
family member or give it to a family member?
But, well, you can't just give it. We have to know, because
Yeah.
otherwise we get caught, drawn into family disputes at times that you don't want to get drawn into family disputes. But the other issue Tom had mentioned a little bit about, and those are things we really need to focus some energies on. We talked, Ted, we kind of waited till we got our parks director. We really need to, you know, look at, I hate to say the word master plan, but we really need to look at
How
the
the
physical
cemetery's
layout of that
gonna grow out.
cemetery.
Yeah.
Because opening up new sections, what they would do, and Carolyn said this, is Ray, the former cemetery section or whatever, would go out and line them up and do whatever else and just open up more field. You know, things have changed and we really need to look at still economizing space, but there's a different type that people want. We need to look at the business side and say, let's provide a product. You know, if we opened up some of that woods and we had a little pathway that had some benches on it, and there's not just in a space, but there's, what do they call them? We put several columbariums,
Columbarium.
where you have this big granite thing and it takes up a footprint, you know, 8 by 8, but you can actually put, you know, 84 people into various sections on there. And not one person, it's not like it used to be that you did that at a family. We may need to invest on that as a cemetery, because the space that it takes up is minimal, but you have to pay for a little bit of the granite. But
Well, one other area we haven't talked on is the house and what we're going to do with it, the barn and things like that too. So
Right.
that's something.
and those are some, I think, you know, that when you get down to talking about an advisory committee, if we get one established, some of that may spill over. Or maybe an advisory role, it's still going to be what's in the best interest from the city, looking at operating the whole facility. But we'll need to come back, and probably the finance committee may be a logical group to bring some of those things to.
Okay. What are you looking at?
Well, I had a picture of a columbarium when I was in Valparaiso, Indiana. I was out running one morning and took this picture, and it was a big cemetery, very much like ours, but they had built this area that seemed to be newer, and so I was looking for the picture. I was going to send it to you.
We have to really address that from a business side, because it's one thing, the space, but literally I think people, you know, if they've got a lot there that they bought, but if it's people that haven't, we're not one of their first choices, I don't think, because there's just not a whole lot.
To be
I'm saying
skeptical.
that if people are, because they grew up here and they lived here their whole life, yeah, they're probably going to go there. But I think in the Carolyn shirt, I think there's enough people that are, so I think we can make it more attractive, and not just from the business, I hate to say it's a business standpoint, but again, it provides the community with a, you know, whatever, something that's a little bit more attractive and whatever.
For the students, if you're new in Delaware, or you don't know the history, there's 2 Miss Americas that are buried in the cemetery. And you can go out and actually call Carolyn, she can tell you where they're at. And the Historical Society has tours out there several times a year and gives a breakdown on Civil War veterans and on out. It's really interesting. It's a quite old cemetery. what'd you say, it was 1850?
51.
51.
No, it's got a lot of history.
Got a lot of history to it. Okay, well, we'll look forward to meeting again on this subject.
Yeah, I mean, I think
matter.
what we can do is if there's just get some feedback. And then I think the next, month or two, a couple of months, we can.
And feel free to, if for reason, I can't imagine where, someplace you got into the discussion about cemeteries and you talked to, and something popped in, just send an email because you may not remember it in a month or two when we have a meeting, but just send some thoughts through. You send it to me, Carolyn, Ted, or whatever else, and we'll see if there's.
And any interest in the council people want to serve on that, I don't necessarily have to, even though it's in my ward. But I did it, I think, 5-6 years. It's quite interesting. There's a lot of history and different subject matter than what we're used to. Okay, any further comments on what we've discussed this evening? Okay, it doesn't say anything from the input from the public. We left that off because it's more of a work session. I want to thank my colleagues for meeting on Jug Week. First time ever we've had a meeting of this nature. Staff for your input. Carolyn, thank you for taking the time to share with us. I'm not going to say anything about our secretary. She has to be here. Tom and Dean for your input on both these subject matters. The refuge one is going to be quite an undertaking, I think, in 2017. And we'll have to have a lot of discussion on that. With that, I will have a motion for adjournment. Second? Second. We're adjourned at 7:26. Thank you.